Lord God, we come to you today on this Sabbath morning, this beautiful day, and we want to give you all praise and glory. We ask that you would help us to understand these truths for this time. Please help me to explain clearly. Please help everyone listening to be able to focus and to understand what I'm trying to explain. And as we work these things through together, may they become clearer, that we may understand more. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we're going to talk today about politics, and we're going to talk about geopolitics, world politics, and what I want to frame it in terms of is argumentative techniques. So if we looked at debating or arguments between individuals, there are different tactics that are used when people are arguing. Some of them are legitimate argumentative or rhetorical techniques, and some of them are manipulative. And we're going to sort of take some of those ideas and then transfer them to a political setting or an international setting and see that some of those same tactics and manipulative techniques can also be used between nations. So this is because we know we're in an age of what kind of warfare. If somebody, that's an easy question, we can do a bit of interaction. So what kind of warfare are we in today?
Information
warfare. Great. So if it's information warfare, it's like a war of ideas or a war of narratives, a war of getting everyone to believe your point of view, right? Whether that be the left wing or the right wing, or Russia trying to sell their point of view and the United States trying to sell theirs in their war of narratives. People want to convince everyone else to take their side, as in, I'm the good one, they're the bad one, believe me. So we see that the kind of warfare is an ideological warfare today. And I think a lot of people recognise that in the media, and we understand that, and also the counterfeit understands that. So some terminology we're going to just discuss and introduce, and then we'll try to tie that into what's happening in the world today. So has anybody heard of this term before called ad hominem? If you've heard of that, let me know, and if you know what it means. Has anybody heard of that one?
Heard of it, but don't know what it means.
No. Okay, yeah, because it's Latin, right? So it sounds fancy. It's a fancy sounding thing. So you've heard of it? It means to the person. And this is a fallacious, they call it a fallacious technique. So fallacious means like fallacy or like faulty. It's a faulty type of technique. It's not really a good way to have a good, productive discussion with somebody. It's like a cheating way or an underhanded way of winning an argument. So according to, I think it was Wikipedia I got this from, the definition of ad hominem, it said it's attacking a person's character or motivations rather than the position they're holding or their argument. So you're kind of going for the personal attack on this one, which is quite, it's hominem, a bit like Homo sapien or something like that, to the person. So you're attacking the individual. So they've accused you of something, but you accuse them personally. This appeals to the emotions rather than to logic or reason. There's another phrase which is similar, you might have heard. Has anybody heard this one called the pot calling the kettle black? Let me know if you've heard that one, if you understand what that one is supposed to mean.
Yeah, I heard that one before.
Okay. Do you know what it means, what the background story would be for a pot calling a kettle black?
I'm thinking it's when they were both cooked over the fire, so they'd all just go real like charred, and so it's kind of just a way of saying that's a hypocritical thing to say.
Yep, exactly. So there's, you know, two instruments, two utensils sitting there. They're both charred from the soot that's risen up. And one of them says to Ella, like, "You're disgusting, you're black, look at how dirty you are." And then the kettle says back to the pot, "You're no better than me, so you've no right to talk. You have no right to accuse me. You're basically a hypocrite," which is exactly what that is. Now, this is a type of ad hominem attacks. There are different kinds of ad hominem attacks, but if you're losing an argument, or, you know, maybe you're just not a very good, maybe you make mistakes in your arguments, but to do this kind of attack, it misses the point of the actual accusation. Okay, so the kettle that's getting accused of being black, it's a legitimate thing. They actually are dirty, but when, you know, they just point the finger back, nobody's going to actually do anything about it. It's like, well, you're just as bad as me. We're both bad together, and that's just how it is. You have no right to accuse me of anything. In a personal situation, this was another example that came up when I researched it. Quoting, "As bickering couples and parents of siblings will know, this happens in daily life all too often. You lied about where you were last night," a person feeling wronged will say, to which, instead of owning up, the partner replies, "Well, what about you? You lie all the time." So, of course, this is a way of deflecting that accusation and throwing mud back on the accuser. So this happens in, you know, personal situations. It can happen between individuals, but this can also happen between countries. So I'm going to introduce another word which you may have heard. I think you probably would have. It's called whataboutism. Now, this one has come up because it's been in a few of the articles that have been shared with us, and it's been mentioned in some presentations. So what I'll do now is share screen and we can read about it. So I will ask for volunteers to read. Let me just pop up my quotes thing. So it's quote number 1. Let me try to zoom in on that. Okay, if I could have a volunteer to read that, please.
I can read for you, Catherine. The term whataboutism is a portmanteau or blend of what and about, is synonymous with whataboutery, and means to twist criticism back to the initial critic. It's an argumentative tactic where a person or group responds to an accusation or difficult question by deflection. Instead of addressing the point made, they counter it with, "But what about X?" Soviet propagandists during the Cold War were trained in a tactic that their Western interlocutors nicknamed whataboutism. Any criticism of the Soviet Union, Afghanistan, martial law in Poland, imprisonment of dissidents and censorship was met with a "what about apartheid South Africa, jailed trade unionists, the Contras in Nicaragua, and so forth." Journalist Luke Harding described Russian whataboutism as practically a national ideology. Writing for Bloomberg News, Leonid Bershidsky called whataboutism a Russian tradition. Julia Ioffa called whataboutism a sacred Russian tactic and compared it to accusing the pot of calling the kettle black.
Thank you. Okay, so you can see that this is a kind of ad hominem attack, but we're talking now about countries and this idea of the pot calling the kettle black. So hopefully we're all together on this, and what we can tie in here is the Soviet connection for this and some of the history of their tactics that they've used against the United States. So let me just write up some summaries, and hopefully I can share slides of the pictures of the board with you afterwards, and this can form some notes if you like. So it's a saying that's like, "But what about?" And that's that's the phrasing that goes with it. It's a kind of ad hominem attack, which means it's a fallacious one. It doesn't produce any real good outcomes. And this is associated with Soviet propaganda. Okay, great. So we're going to move on to now a country who's thinking, they actually had the similar kind of thinking about themselves. So let's have a little look at Germany. This is revision, so we should maybe have some idea where we're heading with this. Okay, Germany in 1970. So it's 1970, this is still the Cold War. It's going to be 1979, the Pope's going to visit the United States. They're going to develop this thing together until they work together to take down the Soviet Union. So America is going to take a certain approach towards the Soviet Union. Germany, though, is taking another approach. And back in 1970, they come up with a deal. So let's have a look at that. We'll read some of this article, which was shared in the broadcast, I think, and during Vespers. We were all wrong, how Germany got hooked on Russian energy. So let me share that. And if somebody can read. We'll go with quote 2. Okay, it's zoomed in nicely for you. Yeah, if somebody's willing, it's a long one, but if you don't mind.
I could read if you like.
Appreciate that.
On Sunday, the 1st of February 1970, senior politicians and gas executives from Germany and the Soviet Union gathered at the upmarket hotel Kaiserhof in Essen. They were there to celebrate the signing of a contract for the first major Russia-Germany gas pipeline, which was to run from Serbia to the West German border at Marktredwitz in Bavaria. The relationship would benefit both sides. Germany would supply the machines and high-quality industrial goods. Russia would provide the raw materials to fuel German industry. High-pressure pipelines and their supporting infrastructure hold the potential to bind countries together since they require trust, cooperation, and mutual dependence. But this was not just a commercial deal. As the presence at the hotel of the German economic minister Karl Schiller showed, for the advocates of Ostpolitik, the new Eastern policy of re-establishment of cordial relations towards the Soviet Union and its allies, including East Germany, launched the previous year under Chancellor Willy Brandt. This was a moment of supreme political consequence. Schiller, an economist by training, was to describe it as part of an effort at political and human normalization with our eastern neighbors. Thomas Urban, examining the psychological roots of Ostpolitik, pinpoints 2 emotions in Germany's relationship with Russia: nostalgia and guilt. He described to me the memory of Bismarck, who saw the alliance with Russia as an anchor of stability in Europe. But then there was also the feeling of guilt because of the German attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, with millions of dead. It meant it was difficult to criticize the Red Army or the Soviet repression, since to do so means you do not recognize the greatest crimes in history.
Thank you, Lynn, for reading that. Okay, so can we see, as we're looking at that article, how this idea of the pot not wanting to call the kettle black, because the kettle's just going to throw that accusation straight back. This is kind of the thinking that Germany had in this time period, this feeling of guilt, also that bit about nostalgia as well, but particularly the guilt is where we want to focus today. So they chose a policy the year before, 1969, called Ostpolitik, and then the full name of that is actually New Ostpolitik. So I'll just look that up as a note for us, and we'll just put the definition there. So Germany's like that. And this is called the New Eastern Policy. Put the date there as well, 1969. That date comes up quite a lot, doesn't it? So we've got that. All right. And we also had the policy of, I don't know how to say this properly, Wandel durch Handel. Anyway, spelt with a W. And its meaning is change through trade. So let's have a little look at that as well from Wikipedia and then back at that article. So I'll share a couple of quotes with you. Again, if somebody can just jump in and volunteer. Down to this one here. If somebody can jump. Yep, thanks.
Now, Wandel durch Handel, German for change through trade, is a term referring to a political and economic notion mostly associated with German foreign policy of increasing trade with authoritarian regimes in an effort to induce political change. Although most strongly associated with Germany, similar policies have been pursued by several Western countries. The policy came under intense scrutiny following the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. In April 2022, European Commissioner for Economy Paolo Gentiloni stated that the notion of Wandel durch Handel, of bringing about change through trade, has shown its limitations, saying that we need to rethink our relations with autocratic regimes and strengthen our ties with like-minded partners.
Thank you, Marilyn. Okay, and if I can have somebody read this one straight next, and this one's more quotes coming out of that same article about we were all wrong about the gas pipeline. That's the context of these quotes here. So if somebody could read this as well. And we're just looking at now, they're in 2022, Russia's invaded Ukraine, and now they're basically looking back at this policies which they had brought in some time ago. So if somebody could just go ahead now.
I was wrong.
The former, sorry,
Sorry,
Ray, do you want to go?
No, you go, Josephine.
I was wrong, the former German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble says, simply, we were all wrong. In recent weeks, even Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German president, a totemic figure of the Social Democrats and greatest German advocate of the trade bridge between East and West, has recanted. He admits he misread Russia's intentions as he pursued the construction of a new undersea gas pipeline. My adherence to Nord Stream 2 was clearly a mistake, he told German media in April. We held on to bridges that Russia no longer believed in and that our partners warned us about. This is an extraordinary admission for a man who acted as Chief of Staff to Gerhard Schroeder, the Social Democratic Chancellor from 1998 to 2005, and thereafter a lavishly rewarded and much reviled lobbyist for Vladimir Putin. Steinmeier was also Foreign Minister under Chancellor Merkel and a great evangelist for Wandel durch Handel, the concept that trade and dialogue can bring about social and political change.
Thank you. Okay, so we're seeing now it's 2022 and they're saying we were all wrong and we didn't listen to people who warned us, and this idea about changing an autocratic or dictatorial regime through dialogue, it hasn't worked. In fact, it just made things worse. So let's just now compare that with something which is a similar idea. it's this idea of the beautiful picture, okay, of change through dialogue. And what does that remind us of? Does anyone remember? Another philosophy that's got this beautiful picture.
Is that the one with relationships, like men protecting and providing for women is just a pretty picture, and similar to the way that the antebellum South, is that it? From like Gone with the Wind is just a pretty picture of a really ugly thing.
Yeah, I guess it is. It's not what I was heading towards, but yeah, I can see your connection there. Something.
Libertarianism.
Which one? Oh, Marilyn again.
Libertarianism.
Yeah, that's where I was heading. So yes, I'm not saying you're wrong, Ray. I think that's a valid point. But where I was heading towards is libertarianism. You might remember that it was presented to us and tried to be sold to us as a beautiful picture because it sounds lovely, it sounds beautiful. Just like this idea about change through trade and dialogue, it sounds beautiful. In the same way, we have this libertarian idea of not using force, but giving people time and dialoguing with them and hoping to change them through that sort of not forceful way. So I should stop sharing, but in fact, I'll leave it there because we're going to read a couple more quotes there. So I'll just slide us down to the next one. So if somebody could read, we've got lots of quotes, so don't be shy. We'll be doing lots of reading.
As I read that long read in The Guardian, it really stood out that Germany had that same beautiful picture as libertarianism. Libertarians sell for the United States. And it was interesting seeing that play out internationally in the way Germany has related, especially to Russia and China. But authoritarian countries in general, what they really fought for, and you can trace it right back to the Cold War history, but it's also been through the 2000s and right up until very recently, the belief that trade and dialogue can bring about social and political change.
Thank you so much. I might just do this one as well. It's also from the same, it's Elder Tess speaking in the presentation. If somebody could jump in and read this one as well, and then we'll put some notes up.
I'll read it. Libertarianism is that beautiful picture that if a society that does have problems with equality, it does mistreat portions of the population. It's a society that is sexist, that's patriarchal. Libertarianism sells this idea. This is how members or former members of the movement sold this idea. If there are sexist members of the movement, sexist men primarily, but also women that have been abusive, then we should not remove them from classes. We should not reprimand them. We should not accuse them. What we should do is allow everyone absolute freedom to attend whatever presentations they want to attend, camp meetings alongside women that they've mistreated. We should listen to them, hear their side of the story. We should just prioritize freedom, be non-accusatory, and not ever enact discipline. And then, as this freedom-conscious movement progresses, then through dialogue, through friendship, through community, those who have wrong views will learn. They will grow, they will change. And we can all just get along without punishing people or accusing people. It's been an appealing message for quite a lot of people. It sounds beautiful until you look at human nature and reality.
Thank you for reading, everybody. Okay, so you can see that similarity there. So there's differences and there's similarities. So Germany had this idea of change through trade. And this was compared with, as a beautiful picture, with libertarian thinking. No force, basically, no discipline, no force. Similarities between the two. Libertarianism, we usually see that with domestic policies. That's where you see that often portrayed here. And this one, we're looking at foreign policy. But we can see the similarities there. But the problem is it's a beautiful picture, and it would be great if that was possible. But the problem is that the beautiful picture is really fighting against human nature and reality, which is why it doesn't work. What actually happens, which we see Germany is now recognising. They're looking at the reality of the outcomes and that it didn't work. Okay, so now we're going to consider the far left, and it's similar in terms of this idea about whataboutism that the far left has brought into whataboutism. So I'll pop that up there and we'll look at that a little bit more and tie that back in. The far left. And how does the far left kind of go along with this whataboutism idea? What they're saying is America has guilt in its past. How dare it go and intervene in other nations? And so this kind of thinking. So let's have a look at another quote from Elder Tessa's study, and I'll share screen. Okay. Right, let's go with that when someone's ready, thanks.
Max Blumenthal was speaking on the grey zone, and he was attacking US restrictions on Chinese imports. And at the very beginning of his attack against the US restrictions on Chinese imports, he began by reminding everyone that the date he was doing this video was the anniversary of the United States invasion of Iraq, and the hypocrisy of the United States to take a hardline approach with China over China's mistakes, even though he denies that China has mistakes, but a hardline approach with China, whereas they had invaded Iraq. And this type of whataboutism gets brought into this left-wing, right-wing, isolationist, interventionist argument in the United States.
Thank you, Ray, appreciate that. Okay, so we see that Elder Tessa is bringing the whataboutism back into the question of what the far left is doing. Max Blumenthal, we would recall, is like a commentator, political commentator that's on the far left, extreme far left. And so what he's reflecting here is far left ideology, especially when it comes to the United States. This idea that how dare the United States take a hardline approach on China because the United States had Iraq. And so basically you have no right. It's hypocritical to be taking a hardline on China. So hopefully that's clear, and you can see that that is whataboutism in action there. What whataboutism does, because we remember its ties back to Soviet propaganda, it ends up being that the far left people, prominent figures, end up having the same talking points as Russia does today. You'll see a lot of similarities between the narratives you would see on Russia Today or other Russian media sources, government state propaganda sources. It's quite similar, and so they find themselves saying the same kind of things. That's one of the outcomes of that. And also, like what it was with Germany, it ends up being that far left figures work with and don't really have big issues working with authoritarian or dictators, authoritarian leaders or dictators, they end up kind of working with them, visiting their countries and things like that. So these are two of the things that kind of come out of this that are quite bad. So let me just put some notes here. So this is like, what about Iraq? So that's like whataboutism. What about Iraq? And it's Russian talking points. And yeah, working with authoritarians. Okay, so hopefully we can see that. Now, this is similar to Germany, right? Working with Russia and authoritarians and that kind of thing. And it was just like Germany's guilt was affecting them and their policies. In the same way, it's a feeling of guilt over what's happened here that's affecting them and basically tying their hands or making them unable to then deal with things in the world that ought to be dealt with. It's almost, I had a word for it, but it's escaped me. So in terms of guilt, yes, Germany had guilt. The United States, it was the USSR that was accusing them of their how they treated slaves and things like that. That's legitimate. There was real guilt there in both cases. And there is a proper and right way to deal with guilt. Often that is to build monuments and to do things to remind us never to do that again. So there is a place for guilt. But when it comes to human rights issues and needing to deal with them, then it's a different story. And so we'll get into why and how that is. So next, in order to understand intervention and interventionism, I'm not sure the right word there, we're going to look now at the paleo-conservative and the neoconservative view and the history, recent history from 1989 to 2009, where we see this shift from neoconservative to paleoconservative. And before we get into that sort of more recent history, we're going to go back just a little bit further as well, back to World War II actually. So I'm going to swap the board around and we'll look at the timeline. I'm going to open up though, if anybody wanted to give a description of what the difference is between neoconservative and paleoconservative is. What do you remember about it?
Paleoconservative is non-intervene. New conservative is intervention. They're okay with that.
Anyone else? Do you know what these prefixes mean?
Neo was new and paleo was old, wasn't it?
Yeah. New and old. Okay. And why is this one considered old? Do you remember? What's old about it? No, nobody's sure. It's basically, it's like the Republican stream or the conservative side has gone back to their old ways. So this was their original type of position from early in the United States history, an America first mindset. So this is how conservatism was back in the day. Then we went through a period of new conservatism. So once we hit sort of around the 1980s or so, we see a new kind of conservatism. So that's why this one's called new. And now it's turned back to this one, paleo. So we're kind of like going back to the old style. All of this is Republican side. but they did go through a phase of intervening around the world. So that's why the word paleo is here, what the reason is for it. This one here, they really, when I looked up on Wikipedia, they really wanted to promote democracy around the world. Okay, and there were some problems with what they did, but one of the main drivers was to promote democracy around the world. And so they felt that they had the right or the obligation to go and intervene in countries around the world. Whereas the paleos, they're not interested in that. They're more interested in looking after America and protecting themselves. So let's go through some of the histories, or did anyone have anything more to say on that? Actually, I'll just pause there.
No, just that it seems frustrating to me, just general people, when you talk to people, they seem to blame what Bush did on America. They can't seem to have that concept to divide up in their own minds, that it actually has a huge difference as to who is actually in.
Yeah, so we're going to look at Bush and what was going on and what the motivations were when they went and did their intervention. What was driving them, and was it all really wrong and evil, or was there some honourable things that they were trying to achieve there, so that we can understand the complexity of it, and then draw out, you know, how much guilt do they have over this, right? And what they could have done better and why. So we'll look at it a little bit more. Thank you, Marie. So I'm going to take us back now to World War II, and this line is just going to be about the fight between these two ideologies in the conservative stream.
Can I say something, Catherine?
Yes.
Is it America first is more local, and then promoting democracy around the world is more like a world scope? I was just thinking about local, and maybe this is way out of your topic. And sorry.
So no, that's
Let
okay.
everybody say.
In all of this is going to be about foreign policy. So how the Conservatives see America's role in the world and how they should approach other countries. So just we're talking about international affairs at the moment, not domestic. Does that help?
Thank
you. That's okay. All right, so World War II, they were divided over whether or not to intervene. And then at the end of World War II, because they did end up joining the war, as we all know, at the end of that, they took down, the result was they had taken down Hitler. So how do you think that made them feel? That made them feel really good, because they intervened and basically, you know, they saved the world. It was a great outcome, a huge success. And it sort of, what we say, maybe it was like a win for neoconservatism, if I'm going to put it that way. So I'm just going to put neo here, when I'll put in brackets where it kind of swung a little bit to, or who it supported. So at the end of World War II, we see intervention has taken place. It was really great outcome. So it supports a neoconservative position. Then we get to the civil rights era. And it's an interesting one. I wonder what you think, how that affected things. So civil rights. And what happened here is that it became really ugly or really unpopular to be explicitly racist. So conservatives were not quite, you know, that basically they rejected explicit racism.
Catherine, can I just mention something, if that's okay?
Yeah.
With World War II in particular, there was a non-intervention party versus intervention. So it became it was really a good versus evil thing. And those who were non-intervention really became very, very unpopular. So that's why World War II was a big wake-up call to intervene into evil stuff around the world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you see things starting to change there. One of the things that Elder Tess had mentioned in this study that I'm reviewing is that you can see it was a traditional approach to do an America first paleo approach, even when, if you go back to when, after the American Revolution and then France needed help, the Americans were not inclined to do that and get involved. They wanted to, you know, look after themselves in America, and so they had more of a paleo approach. You could even see it back then. That was their tradition. It's only when you're coming up to here that you see this sort of neo thing popping up, which is why we're looking at it, and it's going to obviously build up until we get to Bush and so on, and then we're seeing it changing back. So yes, absolutely. Thank you. So okay, so we see the rejecting explicit racism. This makes paleoconservatives seem kind of racist, right? This America First approach. So it's supportive to the neoconservative cause, that one. Okay, then we're going to look at the 1980s to the 1990s. And there's a bit of pushback from paleos here. There's somebody called Pat Buchanan. And he was influential in conservative circles. He was influential with the with Reagan, and he pushed for an America First agenda. That was his slogan when he ran for president, was America First. So it wasn't discreet, it's very overt. And there were others, right? So I'll just put Anne Coe. There were other prominent figures that were coming out and speaking publicly. Yeah, some of them quite ugly, really. So you see this this sort of move, some move toward paleo here. Okay, but also during this period, as we're heading up to, so put 1989 here. In this period leading up to 1989, even though they were kind of pushing for, some of them were pushing for an America First policy, they could still see that the USSR, and you know, it's the Cold War, they kind of made an exception for the USSR because, you know, it's so evil and so bad and so powerful. If we don't do something, we'll be in trouble. So they kind of compromised, I guess, a bit, if you like, on Russia, on USSR. So the fact that that was going on was really more helpful for the neoconservative side. So there's different opposing views here. But when we get to 1989, we end up with a situation where they've kind of dealt with the USSR. It's, you know, Berlin Wall fell, 1991 comes, now we go to Russia. And so it's like they've dealt with the evil thing in the world that they made an exception for. And now what? This idea of now what are we going to do? We don't have this great threat. And that would then swings it a little bit back towards the paleo-conservative side, because that exception we made for the USSR, that's now dealt with. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'll just put up here, now what? Now what do we need to intervene in? We don't really need to anymore. Now we can focus on ourselves. Next on our line, we're going to look at 9/11. Okay, 9/11, what happens there? We know, but begins the war on terror, right? The 9/11 attacks, and we see war on terror here. Now that is a neo-conservative approach. And we see, what else could I go mark here? Afghanistan, right? They went into Afghanistan and they dealt with the Taliban. And for the United States, this was like from their point of view, a big disaster. And as we look at Iraq as well in 2003, war, soldiers dying, money getting spent, you know, all this stuff going on. Whereas this 1945 was really successful and a great, you know, celebration. Here we're just seeing this, it's looking like a big disaster. And conservatives are not happy about this. So this, all of this influences things back towards a paleo view. So yeah, we've got sort of neo here, but we can see that the paleos are now starting to get agitated about it or starting to speak up or push back. 2008, what happened in 2008? It's actually, we're talking about the financial crisis. Running a space here. Financial. So we can look at international trade agreements and things like that as well when we're looking at foreign policy. And in 2008, they also had the election of Obama, and Obama's going to be here in 2009, where we see a real shift as well. 2009 is a real turning point. And I'll mark things there and then it's all right. Okay, so what's happening here in 2009? They've had a financial crash. There's a sluggish recovery. It's people are in pain, you know, financial pain, and they would like a more isolationist approach in terms of trade, international trade. Let's look after America first, support our own industries and businesses, and that kind of idea. Also in 2009, we know the Tea Party movement is rising up. We also see this idea of the white replacement theory is kind of coming up as well. White replacement theory also is leaning a paleo point of view. And here, Elder Tess had marked basically the death of the neocon kind of dominance. So how do we write that up here? I'll put economy, just have to abbreviate it so it fits in there. Again, Obama, there's more that she had to say about Obama and what he did in this time period, but our Vespers was cut short and we don't have the next one. But Obama is connected here. There were some clues, like she gave some clues, but she didn't get into the details. That was going to happen next time. And this idea of white replacement. So a lot of that stuff, we see 2009 as a real turning point. Even, yeah, we're just with the Tea Party and all of that stuff happening in the Republican stream. And we know 2009 is a key waymark on our own line as well. So it's fitting that this is a major point here. So we're marking here 1989 to 2009 as a transition from neo to paleo. So that's some of the history there, and some of the definitions on what the neo and paleo conservatism stands for. So now we want to just look at the motivations here with some of the intervention that the neoconservatives did. Because that's what comes under fire a lot, isn't it? So how bad were the neoconservatives? All right, so let's look at their motives. All right, so let's read a quote from the same study, the Vespers study, and then we'll just jot down some of the main points here that we can pull out from that quote. So I'll share the screen. Okay, so this is Elder Tess speaking in Vesper's session that we had. Somebody could read that, please.
Universal human rights cultural, and if neoconservatives are attempting to spread universal human rights, they're not attempting to spread Western culture, because universal human rights are not Western culture. I think that George Bush was motivated by suppressing a country that he saw as a threat, that kind of need to dominate and have this invincible army and be the unilateral most powerful country on earth was a motivating factor. I also believe that with a degree of arrogance and a degree of naivety, they genuinely believed that just by toppling a government, they could bring equality, human rights, freedom, and a democratic government to Afghanistan. I think that was incredibly naive and arrogant, but not necessarily a wrong motivation. The problem is that we look at Afghanistan as radical feminists. The misogyny in society in Afghanistan is easily seen through the Taliban, but it's actually cultural. The misogyny is cultural, and the United States could not just go in and overthrow the Taliban, because what they would be fighting in Afghanistan is culture. But I don't think that's imposing Western culture on Afghanistan. What it should be about, if their motivations were pure, and I'm sure they weren't, what would be about universal human rights? What do you do when you have a country that is committing horrific human rights violations?
Thank you, Kate. All right, so let's pull out some of the key things here. We're not going to brush over some of these mistakes and problem areas. We'll list them all out. But what we see is we get sort of like a mixed picture of their motives.
No.
So,
Okay.
Pardon?
No.
I'm not sure if somebody's speaking to me or if they're not muted. Okay. So this wanting to dominate against threats and the unilateralism. Oops. But mixed in with all of this, well, we can also say there was naivety and arrogance. Right? That's how you spell it. And there was mistakes. So all of this we acknowledge. But also they wanted to promote, they wanted to spread democracy. Equality. Human rights. And freedom to these places. Okay, so this here, and she said they genuinely believed it. I'll just go put it, they had a genuine hope that they would achieve that outcome, which are good. And because these are universal rights and not culture, that makes a difference too. And we'll talk more about that. Okay, universal rights here, these ones. So then what she's speaking about here, and I'll just work on this on board without starting again. What you've got here is the USA fighting Afghanistan. And I wrote down that they're bringing in basically universal human rights, but they're fighting not a government. What they don't really realise is that They're coming up against a sexist culture. I'll make it look like some swords clashing there. That's what they're warring against, is actually a sexist culture, but they don't really understand that it goes that deep. So they feel like if they deal with the surface problem, the Taliban, then they can solve the actual problems. This here, as Elder Tess described, is not Western culture. They're not bringing in a Western culture. They're trying to bring in universal human rights. Now, when we're looking at, do you remember the definition of radical feminism? Does anybody remember what radical means?
Radical's like the root, isn't it?
Yes. Radical means the root. Okay, so if we're looking at Afghanistan, maybe we see a plant there. And what we're seeing here is what's on the surface. Their politics and their religion. But underneath is the root of the problem. And under here we see sexist culture. So the naivety here, it's this idea that you can go on here and just cut this part off and the problem will be dealt with. But that's not going deep enough. And so that's why there's naivety there. There's a problem in Afghan culture that goes back further than the Taliban. There was an article shared back in the media broadcast about, it was written by women or a woman in Afghanistan, that she basically said, it was always bad here. It's just gone from one kind of bad to another kind of bad. We've always had a problem with misogyny here. So taking down the Taliban was a naive approach. So they made mistakes, yep. So we can see there's a mixture here. Some genuine good ideals and also some problems. What the outcome of, though, if you have a Bush-style government, is that generally across the world, it keeps this kind of thing, it does keep authoritarianism at bay. Sure, it's it's always a fight, it's always a struggle, but it has the effect of restraining these authoritarian regimes around the world. So we acknowledge they had problems, they had mistakes, but there was some good mixed in there, and also an outcome that helped restrain authoritarian regimes around the world. Okay, so we're going to talk more about authoritarians now, and we're going to see what happens when a different kind of president comes in. And 2016, we get Trump, who's got a different approach. So what kind of approach does Donald Trump have? Is it neoconservative or paleoconservative?
Paleo.
Paleo, yeah. All right, so I've run out of boards now, but it's okay, I'll share everything later. Bring this off. We're going to read a quote, but a little bit about Donald Trump's approach. I mean, I think we're all fairly aware about how Donald Trump had approached and dealt with different dictators around the world. Think of Kim Jong-un and Xi and Putin and all that Trump had said and done with some of these. But just as a point of an example, I will share a quote that I found that was interesting to me. Okay, this is from an article from the National Review called Trump and Dictators. And it's just an example of his, one of his approaches. So go ahead if somebody could read this.
Donald Trump's first presidential trip abroad was to Saudi Arabia. On landing, he said, "We are not here to lecture. We are not here to tell other people how to live, what to do, who to be, or how to worship." In the past, American presidents have spoken for people under dictatorship, people who can't speak for themselves. President Trump signaled that those days were over, and that dictators would not have to worry overmuch about criticism or lecturing from Washington.
Yes, thank you. So, basically, just going back to what Russia's line that they give. Russia says, what about you, USA? And Trump is similar. He's not going to accuse anyone. And I've got another quote from him, but before I mention that, I will also say that, if you just look at how things are in the world today in terms of authoritarian regimes, I think most of us recognise that there's been a rise around the world in these kinds of dictatorships. And just not even taking the quote from the article, but just the title, there's a 2022 Atlantic article from the Atlantic. Dictators aren't pretending anymore. The democratic recession is so severe that autocrats now openly stage coups, steal elections, and invade other countries. So that's just the headline. And I think most of us recognise the direction the world has taken. And a lot of that is attributed to this kind of approach that Donald Trump had taken with dictatorships in his time in office. So Russia is saying, what about you, USA? Trump is going to say something really similar. So I'm going to just share the screen again. And this is an article, a quote from a CNN article from 2017. A reader, please.
President Donald Trump appeared to equate US actions with the authoritarian regime of Russian President Vladimir Putin. In an interview released Saturday, Trump made the remark during an interview with Fox News' Bill O'Reilly, saying he respected his Russian counterpart, but he's a killer. O'Reilly said to Trump, "There are a lot of killers. You think our country's so innocent?" Trump replied. This is the second time Trump has defended Putin against the charge that he's a killer by saying, in effect, that the US is no better or different. US Representative Adam Schiff told CNN, "This is as inexplicably bizarre as it is untrue. Does he not see the damage he does with comments like that and the gift he gives to Russian propaganda?"
Thanks, John. Okay, so what we're seeing here is basically whataboutism again. Okay, so Russia will say, "What about you, United States?" And the United States is going to say, "Yeah, you're right. We are no better. What about our US skill? We're just as bad. Yeah, what about US skills?" Now, we know there's a difference. When Russia and United States, there's a definite contrast. And it's not actually true to say that it's as bad. It has a completely different type of government for a start. And there are limitations there. And it's not the same thing. But that's what he was saying, and saying, "Well, what about us? We are no better." So he's sort of even repeating the same line that you're hearing from Russia. And again, what we knew that the far left was saying is the same thing. And they're all saying the same thing here. Yeah, what about US guilt? They bought into it. And it's a mistake. It's a mistake to do that. So these are all mistakes. The difference though, even though they're saying something similar, we need to remember that we can compare and contrast. And does anybody want to explain the difference between the approach of the far left and a paleoconservative. What's different? Because they're actually very different. We've got to contrast them as well. What's the same between them? Basically, what's the same between them is there's a lack of deterrence against oppression. You're not going to take action against oppression in the world if you're buying into this whataboutism thing. What's different between them is they have different reasons for why they come up to this idea. A paleoconservative is interested in America is, we need to close in on ourselves and protect ourselves, and we are the priority. And we let the rest of the world deal with themselves, and we don't really love them or care so much. A far left position is more that we have guilt in our past and we have no right to impose our culture on anyone else. So it's slightly different, not slightly, it's quite different reasons why they come to this same kind of position. So just keeping in mind that they're not the same. That's the main thing I wanted to just highlight there. Okay, so there's two other people that are going to have quite a different approach to this. Who are two people, if you can remember, or maybe you remember just one, who's going to have a different approach to foreign policy that we learned about in Vespers?
Hillary Clinton.
Wonderful, thank you. Exactly where I was heading. Hillary Clinton. All right. She doesn't take this approach. She takes a different approach. A couple of things to mention about Hillary Clinton before we read something is that we know that she had a prophetic role. So she's a significant person as we understand her prophetically. What could have happened or would have happened if she had been elected instead of Donald Trump, that she would have been like a solution to the problem, or at least a big part of the solution to the problems that were happening, or she would take the United States in the right direction. We understand that, and we understand that she won the primaries over Bernie Sanders. That was also discussed in the Vespers studies, that it was her ideology which was the right one in order to make her the candidate for the presidency. Bernie Sanders wasn't elected as that candidate, so his ideology was not the correct one. So even comparing those two, Hillary Clinton's was the correct one. So we see there that she's an important figure. We know that Putin hated her. Why? Why did he hate her? There's reasons for that. She wasn't going to be enabling him to do whatever he wanted in the world. And she spoke up and would have taken action. It's not just speaking, it's taking action. That's key, I think. There's another person. Maybe we'll read Hillary Clinton's speech. We'll take the notes on that on the board, and then we'll talk about this other person who is also significant here I want to mention. But let's look at Hillary Clinton's her speech. What was her prominent speech that she made? A famous speech. Who knows what speech she gave a long time ago? I think it was in 1995. Does anybody know what that speech was called, or who she gave it to?
For the United Nations in China.
Yes. Yes. And do you remember what it was called?
I don't remember the title, just the phrase, all women's rights are human rights.
Yes, that's right. All right, great. So, yeah, if you don't mind, you could read it actually while you're there, if you don't mind. This is a quote from her speech. I've taken some pieces out.
It is a violation of human rights
when women and girls are, and then she lists a series of abuses against women and girls. If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights, once and for all. Now it is time to act on behalf of women everywhere. If we take bold steps to better the lives of women, we will be taking bold steps to better the lives of children and families too. Let this conference be our and the world's call to action.
Thank you. Okay, so I've highlighted a few words there because I wanted to really point out that she's saying act. It's a call to action. It's not a call to change through dialogue. She's talking about taking these things as seriously. And the other thing here is that she's pointing out that these are human rights. And this is the key, really the key to defeating whataboutism. Okay, so it's this idea that if it's universal human rights, that means that it's not some country imposing its culture on somewhere else. So what she's saying is human rights are not a cultural value from Western countries. Women's rights are actually a universal human rights. It's not a Western thing, and we need to act. So this is the this is her this is the same kind of thinking that these two people have. The fact that it's human rights and the fact that it's universal, and the idea that we need to take action, and not only that it's justified to take action, but that it must be done. Okay. Now the other person, anybody want to? I'll give you a last second to, I might give you a clue. It's also related to the UN. It's a person related to UN. It's also about a speech. And it's also a person that was mentioned during Vesper's studies. It's not a woman though, it's a man this time. Anybody know who it is?
Is it that UN Commissioner for Human Rights? I forget his name, but I think he was from Jordan.
Yes, I don't remember where he was from, but yes, that's who I'm talking about. So let me share screen again. We can read a quote from him. So this is Zaid Rad Al Hussein. He was then the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. So that's in 2017. And his speech, which we could watch if we wanted to, but we also saw the transcript of. In it, his key argument really is that gender rights are not cultural. They're not Western, they're universal. And that makes them the same as all other human rights. There's no difference between gender rights and other rights, the right not to be tortured or not to be discriminated against based on your religion or your race. They're all universal human rights, and that is the key to unlocking this dilemma about intervening or not intervening. So let me share this one. If somebody could read quote 12, please.
When the entire weight of a country, feral and menacing, falls like an axe on an illiterate young woman of humble station, with no means to mount a proper defence, it brings home to me, and with terrific force, the unchangeable need for universal rights. Do not dare to tell me human rights are not universal. Do not dare. Could anyone look those women in the eye and say they do not deserve equal universal rights? It is easy to criticise universal rights from afar, but not when you are facing the victims of deep injustice, victims of deprivation, discrimination and violence. The Rohingya, the people of Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, the Central African Republic. Tragically, the list is very long. The case for me is made.
Thank you, Marilyn. So he's saying that there is he's also going to continue to say that there is a response required, and the response is required from the UN, yes, but also from other countries. Because these are universal human rights and not a Western cultural thing, there is a duty for nations to hold other nations to account. He pointed out that these countries have signed up to an agreement to abide by the human rights policies, and then they don't follow them, then they're meant to be held to account. And it's not, he didn't want just the UN to take responsibility for that. He was saying other countries also need to act. So in that case, it could be another Eastern country, but it could also be a Western country. Countries need to take action against this when this happens. So what you can see that there's no whataboutism here, that nations must speak out and act when there's the abuse happening within other nations. So let's read the next quote from his speech, which just sort of, you know, that's where he's basically saying some of this. If somebody could read, please. I'll read it. For states that have accepted their treaty obligations, those commitments are of course binding on them. When they subsequently violate these commitments, are they not primarily responsible? Shouldn't other states hold the defaulting state to account? Why should the responsibility lie solely with the United Nations? Okay, so he's calling for intervention, or at least action. Yeah, action. So let's now have a look. I just want to do another kind of compare and contrast here. I'll pop a note up here about him on the board. So I'm just going to abbreviate it to Al Hussein. And his point is gender rights. And she's talking about women's rights as well. Gender rights are universal. And he's very clear, it's not Western. It's not a Western value. And that it's the same as other human rights, just as much universal as everything else. And also this need for the UN intervention, and also for other countries to hold accountable, the holding to account of other countries. So we all have a responsibility, that's what he's saying here. All right, so that's that there. I do have a copy I can share with everyone after. I'm going to run that off. Does anybody know another term the world is divided into? So sometimes we talk about the West, Western nations, and the East. But there's another term that's sort of a bit more popular today, and it's referring to something similar, but it's different phraseology. Maybe that's not enough clues. We divide the world up into these similar kind of segments, but they've made up like a new term for it.
Is it like the global north and south?
That's it. Thank you. Yeah, that's the one. Good. So the global north and the global south. Okay, so the global north, when we're talking about the global north, we're usually thinking of Western countries. They're not physically north and south, but they're called this. Really, if you look at a map, there's countries mixed in both hemispheres. But when I looked up the definition for this, it said in Wikipedia that these are groupings of countries based on their socio-economic and political characteristics. In the global south, you have areas Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and most of Asia. But with Asia, you exclude Israel, Japan, and South Korea. They're considered to be Western nations or global north. Then in Oceania, we have the countries in Oceania, but you would exclude Australia and New Zealand, which are considered part of the global north. Sometimes these are called developed countries and developing countries. That's another term that's used, although there's some stigma attached, so it's not as popular. And a lot of these countries in the global south are current or former subjects of colonialism. So there's some emotions there attached to colonialism in the global south. Okay, and obviously a lot of their problems that they have, these socioeconomic problems that they have, are a result of the colonialism that they have been subjected to. So this is the world in which we live in today. And according to Al-Hussein's speech, a lot of the complaints he was getting about Western culture being imposed on us, these LGBT and gender rights are getting pushed on us by Western countries. It's like saying, we don't like that the global north is intervening. They want to intervene, and it's about gender. And what the global south want to say is stop imposing your, we're going to call it Western culture on us. So they're angry. Stop imposing your Western culture on us. Except the global north is saying, it's not our culture. This is universal human rights. So, right, so it's not our culture, and we have every right to do it. Okay, so this is the situation, and Al-Hussein saying they're coming and complaining to me. It's falling on deaf ears because I vigorously defend and protect gender rights because they're universal. So I'm not going to listen to these complaints. They're falling on deaf ears. Where is another situation in history where we have basically the identical setup? Anybody think? Or we go back to, pardon?
Would it be slavery, North and South?
That's wonderful, yes. So different dispensation, antebellum, which is referring, hang on, I spelled that wrong, talking and writing at the same time. Antebellum means like before the war. It's usually referring to the American Civil War period, before, you know, as it was building up. Antebellum North and antebellum South. So what's happening here? We want to intervene. We're going to intervene about race. And they're going to say, stop imposing your what culture on us. Basically, they're going to say, you're pushing your culture on us. You're acting like imperialists, like you have the right to come and boss us around and tell us what to do. And these are going to say, it's actually our duty. We have to do this because it's universal human rights. It's not culture. These are real rights that these Black people have, and we're coming in to defend and protect them. So the parallels are quite clear, but of course there are some differences. We have to compare and contrast the way that the United States government was legally set up in this period as the government over those states is a bit different to how the United States operates in a global environment today. But you can see that the situation is the same. The arguments here are the same and the arguments coming back are the same, but we know what was the right thing to do here. We know the right answer for that. And so we can apply it here. So we know what's right and wrong. This is why it doesn't count as Western imperialism, because it's universal rights. That's the key. Okay, now I want to just continue a little longer, and we're nearly at the end. This part here is not review from the studies done in Vespers. This is something that now that I'm just contributing my own thoughts on, because I have been looking a lot at the counterfeit lately, as some of you might know, and studying Pope Francis and reading some of his writings and materials and also his articles. So when we're talking about these complaints from the Global South falling on deaf ears, guess whose complaints? They're not going to fall on deaf ears. Somebody is going to hear this complaint and respond differently, and that would be Pope Francis. Let me share this quote that Al Hussein had given about this idea of falling on deaf ears, because there's actually a supporting quote for that. If somebody could jump in and read for us, quote 14.
An argument I often hear from African and Arab representatives, sometimes even from senior colleagues in the UN, again hinges on the belief that there is no such thing as universal rights, only Western culture and values, dressed up in ornate language that everyone else is forced to swallow. Lurking behind this attack is a deep-seated unease with the advancement of the rights of LGBTI people and the sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls, two sets of rights my office and I vigorously promote and protect.
Thank you. Okay, so let's now look at, actually, I wanted to look at the demographics of the Catholic Church and just see how things have changed over the last, I don't know, how many hundred years, a few hundred years. So if somebody could read these statistics out, then we'll just jot that up because it gives us context for how the Catholic Church operates today.
In 1900,
167 million Catholics in the world, more than 200 million of whom were in Europe and North America. At the time, the makeup of the church was not much different from what it was in the 16th century. By 2000, there were nearly 1.1 billion Catholics in the world, but only 350 million of them were Europeans and North Americans. The overwhelmingly majority, 720 million, lived in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. More than 400 million lived in Latin America alone. By 2025, only 1 in 5 Catholics will be a non-Hispanic Caucasian.
Thank you. So you can see the demographic of the Catholic Church is largely actually in the Global South today. I'll just jot up the differences. So what you had back in 1900, I'll just draw a little bishop's hat there just to help us work out what that is. You had 200 million out of, what was it, 267 million. Most of the Catholics in the world lived in what you call the global north today. And there's not really recent statistics, but we've got a couple. So it's probably not really big enough. Need room for 2. Okay, we're going to put year 2000. This is Catholic again. In the year 2000, you're looking at in the Global South, 720 million out of 1.1 billion. So it's, like 3/4, say, roughly, billion. And just to give an idea of the growth of the Catholic Church as well, in 2018, the number of Catholics in the world at that time was 1.3 billion. So the Catholic Church is it's growing in size due to population growth in a lot of places as well. In the global south, they have had quite a lot of population growth. So when the Pope is representing Catholics, most of these Catholics are actually in the global south, and he himself is from the global south. He comes from Argentina. So that's like a relevant fact to keep in mind. So it's an information war. We said it's an ideological battle. And so Pope Francis is going to make public statements, and he's been doing this for the last 10 years. He's been the Pope for about 10 years now. And he's been accusing the West of something, a certain type of colonization. And he uses this phrase. And the phrase he uses is ideological colonization, he calls it. So it's ideological colonization. That is what he's been saying for a long time. And that fits with information age, information warfare. If they're going to colonize somewhere now, they'll do it ideologically. There are lots of articles on this. If you type that phrase into Google, you'll see a whole bunch of different articles, because Ben saying this for a while. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to read, I'll probably just read these myself, these quotes. So we're on the home stretch. Okay. So I just wanted to give 2 examples. This one is from 2015, noting that this is from the National Catholic Register, which is a conservative stream. There are articles, plenty of articles on this. Pope Francis cautioned on Monday that gender ideologies from the wealthy Western world are being imposed on developing nations by tying them to foreign aid and education in a form of ideological colonization. Think of the Hitler Youth, he said, in reference to the Nazi training programs to indoctrinate young people to party ideas. But how much suffering? Peoples must not lose their freedom, he said. When conditions are imposed by imperial colonizers, they seek to make these peoples lose their own identity and make a uniformity in society, he said. This is the globalization of the sphere. All the points are equidistant from the centre. However, true globalization does not take the form of a sphere, creating uniformity and equal distances from the centre, said Pope Francis. Rather, he said, it is important that it is a polyhedron, multifaceted, so that every people, every part, conserves its own identity without being ideologically colonised. These are the ideological colonisations. So what he's calling for is all the cultures should maintain their unique cultures, and we don't want to make everybody the same, which he's accusing the West of doing. So he's accusing them of enforcing or bringing in their own cultures onto this global south, basically. Now,
Isn't
more
this
recently,
the pot calling the kettle black?
yeah, that's right. And I had wondered whether some of this was due to their own feelings of guilt over what they've done in the past. Clearly, the Catholic Church has a horrible history of and so much guilt there. And I didn't know whether this is part of their trying to, deal with that. I don't know. This non-accusative approach that they have, which is similar to Germany in some ways. Yeah, that's right. So here's another quote. So this is from March 2023, just a few months ago, against conservative stream, just pointing out. Pope Francis has said that gender ideology is one of the most dangerous ideological colonisations today. Gender ideology today is one of the most dangerous ideological colonisations, Francis said in the interview published on the evening of March 10th. Why is it dangerous? Because it blurs differences and the value of men and women, he added. All humanity is the tension of differences. It is to grow through the tension of differences. The question of gender is diluting the differences and making the world the same, all dull, all alike. and that is contrary to the human vocation. Pope Francis has frequently used the term ideological colonisation throughout the 10 years of his pontificate, particularly to describe instances when aid money for developing countries has been tied to contraceptives, abortion, sterilisation, and gender ideologies. So there's a couple of quotes, and also I did find another one which I didn't print up there. He actually goes as far as to calling this blasphemy. So is blasphemy a political or a religious term?
Religious.
Religious term. He's got more than 1.3 billion people that listen to him as a spiritual leader, and he's telling them that this gender rights, things that are being imposed, to do this is actually blasphemy. It's actually against God. I'll read that one as well. Those who use a strategy of making everything the same and eradicating what is different commit the terrible sin of blaspheming God, the Creator. So that's a quote from 2017, and that's from the National Catholic Reporter, which is actually the correct stream. The article was called "Cultural Colonization Blasphemes God by Trying to Alter His Creation." So there's a little bit about a sympathetic ear for these people complaining about these human rights, gender rights in particular. So that's where we've got to. That's basically the end. I'll do a little bit of a summary just to go through where we've been, and then we'll close off. So we started off with discussing how this is a ideological warfare and some of the techniques and tactics that can be used. We looked at Germany and their approach towards the USSR and the reasons why they did that, and then the outcomes as well. We compared that with libertarianism ideas, understanding that sometimes we're talking about foreign policy, but when we're talking about libertarianism, we really see that clearly when we're looking at domestic. We looked at neoconservatism and paleoconservatism and the wrestling between those two ideologies within the Republican stream. We looked at some of the history of some of the intervention that the neoconservatives took and the motives behind it, the mixed motives, and some of the mistakes that they made. We looked at its effect, though, how it was restraining on authoritarian regimes around the world. Even though it was not done that well, it did have that effect on the world, that it had that restraint. Then we contrasted that with Trump, who came in and basically released everything so that these regimes could rise up. And we saw a growth in that until today. We see that there's basically open, they're open about it and not discreet about their authoritarianism tactics, stuff like that. We looked at Hillary Clinton and Saeed al-Hussein and the fact that they could recognise these were universal human rights and not cultural, which is the way to bust this idea of you have no right, because it is a universal value. So it's actually imperative to intervene. We looked at then compared that with the situation with the antebellum period and how the arguments were kind of similar to today, just it was the United States back then, and now we're looking at a global situation today. And then we had a look at Pope Francis. He's saying it is culture, it is colonization. So he's saying the opposite. And then we think about what happens if intervention stops. What if it was to stop today? What would we expect to see? We would expect to see more human rights abuses. And because authoritarianism is closely linked with patriarchy and sexist cultures, we would see a rise in abuse of women and girls and LGBT people in families and everything within countries. So we know that paleoconservatives and the far left are coming at this from different points of view, but they end up with the same kind of result, is that they're basically enabling abuse when they say that they have no right or no interest in intervening. So yeah, that's our study. That's my summary, my revision. So thank you everyone for participating, and let's close in prayer. Lord God, who is a God of every person, a God who loves each and every one of us and values each and every one of us. You don't stratify us into people that are superior and people that are inferior. And you care about the sufferings of women and children and coloured people, and you care about the sufferings of LGBT people around the world. And it breaks your heart. And we know that there will be a better time ahead one day. In the meantime, Lord, help us to understand the prophetic message, help us to understand what's being taught currently as well in the international camp meetings, that we may stay close to that light as it progresses forward, that we may not fall behind, but that we may stay abreast of the new light that you're giving to us. Thank you for these Vespers classes that we have had, which have so much to say to help us to understand our own position and what we should be doing. So we thank you, Lord, for these things. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.